we're going to talk a little bit of the process of technical writing and a few tips and how I do some things. Maybe it helps you guys, gives you a few ideas and basically make things more easier for the reader. Uh, the I'm going to start with talking about what I consider good technical writing, and then we'll enter the details of like writing, edition, and we'll finish with some tools, resources, and how you can earn money from writing uh, freelance. We are also having a job posting here at Semaphore for a full-time technical writer. I'll share the links later. I also share the slides so you can uh, view it at any time. So if you are considering switching job or doing like technical writing for a living, it's a good idea. Maybe you can submit your resume. Let me start with what I consider good writing. At least, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but I think good writing in the technical like area, it's very like simple. It doesn't have extra words. It isn't fancy because people are looking for information and they don't have time, for to read long articles. It's clear and it's interesting. So here's the one very straightforward way of telling what will happen. Uh, Very simple words. You don't need to use fancy words for technical writing. That's good, I think, for us, people that are not native English speakers. It helps us a lot, and I think it gives us some advantage in some sense. Uh, there were a few studies that were done when the web started, because it was a new medium at the time. There were studies from Nielsen and Morkis on 1998 about how people read online. They did like a series of studies, and they still doing them. So if you check that website, you will see that they keep doing studies on how people read online. And I think in the sense that we are working with technical writing, there are two things we have to take into consideration. One is that it's not like a book where people open the book and start, you know, uh, reading one page at a time. They readers tend to scroll and look at the pictures, look at the headers, and they, if they don't find or they don't think it's going to work for them, they're going to leave because there are a lot of options online to read. So they are more active than if you're picking a book or reading a magazine. The other thing is that the readers do not read the whole blog post in general, um, because they like to scroll and see pictures and they pick the things that they need. So we have to think that we have to take that into consideration. We are not writing a story here. Here's one like heat map. This is like tracking the eyes of the readers, and it finds where people tend to fix their sites. There's a little bit of attention to the title, and the first paragraph is very important. The list and the headers are also important there, and there are places where people like skip. Most people skip. So this is like a very visual way of seeing how people read online. uh, and the take here is that when you write something and you post it online, and you only get like one chance to get the attention of the reader. If you don't pick the attention from the beginning, they will leave. They will read other things. Sometimes they don't won't even open your link. So the take here from the study was that we should use something like the pyramid on the right, which is you put like the interesting part at the beginning, so it's like right in the center of the view of the reader. We don't use a structure like the left one, which is like the classic story structure. We go and we put like the good stuff right at the beginning. So putting something like that takes their attention. It may be something like a conclusion, or something you get that's very positive. Like you're going to speed up your workflow 10 times. Put something that's going to uh, make the reader stay. I'm going to write a little bit about the writing process. This is what works for me, but I think there are elements common for everyone. Uh, when we start to write, normally we don't take classes of writing, and we do it like because we need to. And when a good way to start is like just simply to start writing. There's no course you have to take. You can write about anything. Uh, Maybe a blog, or a page like dev2 or hashnote, something on Medium. And it's important, I think it's important to read other people writing and try to maybe imitate, because that's how it gets started. You can like save articles you like and see why do you like them, what do you like about them. So when we start writing, normally we have like an idea, and with that idea we make a proposal, and that proposal has like an outline, which uh, the headers or the subheaders of each um, part of the article. Normally, this is for me, at least it's like a iterative process, because I like start making one outline, then I read a little bit more and take things out, put things in. So until we are satisfied with the outline, it could take some iterations. Once we have the outline, we can like send it to the company we're writing for, or someone else to like give you an opinion, and then we can start with the draft, which is like the first version. Then we have like I have like stage where I simplify, because I personally I take have the tendency to write a lot more, like long-winded paragraphs, and we have like to cut it down. And the final step is someone to, if I can, I mean, we have some tools to do some corrections that I share at the end, near the end of the talk. But if we can get someone else to read it for us, it's even better. And finally, we have someone which is going to review. You know, if the article is what we promised, and maybe they ask us to do some revision or some changes, and then hopefully we'll publish it. So the draft is the first version, and it's going to take. It's always going to be like a lot of work, at least for me. Uh, so I like to have three rules when writing and doing research about the first like version of my draft, which is first to focus on one thing, because it's easy to get lost in other topics, and your article ends up being not about one thing but about a lot of things. So you have to like to decide, I'm going to write about this topic, and you limit, to that thing. Think also who is going to read, who is your like target reader. It's a dev, is a manager, is someone who doesn't have programming knowledge. And another thing that I think adds a lot of like flavor is if you can find details about the people, because there's always people behind the technology. There's always a problem behind, and you want, if you find that, what problem this technology solved, maybe you have like an idea why this is, why what it is. And if you can put that into the article and it works in the article, it tends to add, because people are always interested about other people. So it's a good thing to include if possible. So the first draft is not going to be good. It's going to be like, feel like you don't know what you're doing. It's very normal, and it doesn't go away, at least in my case. So the important thing is to fill that blank page with something. It doesn't need to be good. You don't even have to write everything in English. If you don't remember a word, you can just write it in your native language. There's always time to correct it, or put to-dos, or put placeholders for images. So it's not going to, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's normal to feel it's not going as planned. Uh, so what I like to stay focused and don't get lost in details is to put something at the beginning of the draft. I use this format, which works for me, which is like a very simple header that I take afterwards. But while I'm writing is okay. How do I focus? How I remember day after day what I'm writing, and like if I have an idea for a title, I write it down. If I'm thinking of doing SEO, I think I'm also thinking which words I'm going to use because I have to use them in the text, so they get indexed. Um, and you have some, you remember who are you talking to. Uh, the lead is the first paragraph or the first two paragraphs in the article, and as we've seen, is the attention tends to fall on the lead, and so it's important to have something interesting there to like get the people to continue reading. So going back to the idea of using this inverted pyramid, uh, we want something that's short but also like punchy, maybe something like gets the attention from the people and it should be strong. This is one example of a lead I found like while reading, and this is like 4 paragraph long, very very boring. I I wanted to stop reading that, but I had to because it had information needed. But this is an example of something that, in my opinion, doesn't work because it's it's like it takes too much to go to the point and it's boring. So I think you can take this and put everything in one paragraph or maybe two, and then it should be a lot more strong. So what usually works as a lead, there's no rules. You try something until it works. But something like an interesting story could be a personal story, something that's like contradictory, like a paradoxical, something like, or maybe talking about what you're going to get after reading. Like you're going to be more protective in this way. Something that uh, add some interesting, like bait. And in the case of a documentation, you're writing a page of documentation, you don't need something long. You can just write what the article is about, like one paragraph or one sentence. That's perfectly fine. um, the other thing that's important when we're writing is to use good headings. How to split the article in parts, and they also like they tend to tell a story about the article. So people are going to read your headings more likely than the paragraph. So when you think of the headers and you're writing the outline, you can like put the story. Put like the progression of your how you are going to explain one topic. You can use the headings like read them separately, and they should tell something, some story. So and people are going to use that to jump to the place they are interested in. So one good thing is to keep them short, the headings. We can remove prepositions normally and adjectives to make them shorter. We use keywords from that section, and normally we don't want to use more than H3 headings. Like H2 and H3 are enough. If you can use only H2, it's better, even better. But if you need more, there's usually means there's you're going like too deep. You're like branching off too much. So the other important part of writing are the paragraph, which are like the unit, the building block of the article. And when we write the paragraph, we have to keep that in mind, that there's one idea per paragraph. You have to like keep in mind that. What I like to do is to write before I start writing the paragraph. I like to write a very short sentence or a word about the idea that I'm trying to convey in that paragraph. I keep it like before the paragraph, then I write the paragraph, and after I take it out. So like to reinforce that thing that you have to like separate your ideas in different paragraphs and not mix them. So there are like 3 parts. You can have a paragraph which is only one word or one sentence, but most consist of 3 parts. The first one introduces the topic, and it's going to be easy to read because people tend to read from left to right. So the first paragraph is going to like introduce the thing. This is an example about talking about TypeScript. So we use the keyword first, and we introduce topics. We are going to talk about TypeScript. This is like the first part of my paragraph. The second part can be more than one sentence, and we give examples. We do give expand. We give arguments to like validate our statement. Let's see an example here. We like go deeper into how TypeScript and JavaScript are related in like this second part. And the last part of the paragraph is going to reinforce. It's going to like reaffirm what we said and finish, like close the idea. Here's like ending my paragraph about TypeScript. Like we give some important fact, like to round up the idea. Uh, this is like the complete paragraph in one page, and we can see like the three parts. The important thing about the paragraph is that we have like three things to keep in mind. One is do not say contradictions inside the paragraph, you because it leads to confusion. If we want to compare two ideas, it's better to introduce one in one, the other in another paragraph, and then maybe use a third one to like compare them, but never contradict. You say one thing and next contradict the thing on the same paragraph. That doesn't work. The other thing is to keep it like focused on one idea. And the other thing that's important, and this is what I find more useful, is that the last part of the paragraph like reinforces, and it tends to stay like a few milliseconds longer in the mind, because like the eye is scanning the next part, and it's a good place to put like your conclusion of the idea or some important message, because it's going to stick more if it's at the end of the paragraph. The other thing is, when we are writing, do not just write paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. It's important to put something else to like break a little bit the flow, and do not make the reader. It tends to exhaust the reader to have only text. In some cases, it works having only text, maybe writing an opinion, but I think in most cases you want to have something like the right side version, which has a paragraph, images, list. Maybe there are code snippets, a list, tables, pictures. So one thing that I want to keep in mind is to not put more than three paragraphs in a row without something to break the flow. If we are using pictures, which I think they're a great way of saving work, because you can say a lot with one picture. Keep in mind that you should write some alt text for the picture, because it's going to be indexed by the Google or the search engine, and it's going to add a little bit more chance of you ranking higher, and it helps people with disabilities like to see what's there. So, and you have like two things to keep in mind with picture. One is having some alt text, and in other cases you can also have like a caption below. It depends on the context, but I think the alt text should always be there. And when you are finished with the article, you shouldn't write a lot. When once you say what you want to say, you shouldn't like repeat everything again. So my suggestion is, do not like abuse the time. Just say a little bit, circle down, maybe go back to the introduction, and like go back to that idea you wrote in the lead, and close it and say thank you, and that's it. No, you don't have to write a lot in the ending. There should be an ending, there should be something, but doesn't to be have to be too long. So once we have like the first version, which is not going to be very good, so that's not a problem, because we are now editing. And when we are writing, the important thing about a good writing is that we rewrote it many times. We went over and over and over, and like took pain to like shorten it out, to take things that maybe do not fit or do not add. So there's a lot of going back and rewriting and edition. So that's the part that's going to take more time, and you're going to lose part of your draft. I think it's normal to lose like 20%. At least in my case, to lose, you know, a lot of words in this process. That's okay, because each word we don't put is going to make the work for the reader easier. So what I think a lot, what I see a lot is that people are like afraid to talk in their voice. When they're writing. In some cases, you cannot write because you're writing like some news, or you can you they are, the medium you're using is not fit for writing in the I, in the first person. But I think there are a lot of opportunities lost that we can write like in the first person and like state your opinion, and we like are timid or afraid to do it, but people like in general to have like seeing what other people think, and even if they don't match the have the same opinions, it's good. It's more engaging. So here's an example of I wrote a few days ago, and I wrote it in some way and then I changed it. Like, this is the first version. It's talking about people not having access to their work computers. Some developers like to have admin access to their laptops because they otherwise feel the company does not trust them. So I thought that maybe if this was in reality one opinion, that it was my opinion. So I think it works better if I say it with my voice, and it's stronger. I find it disturbing not having access to my work machine. It's a clear sign of the company's total lack of trust in me. So that's one way of saying, okay, uh, uh, I use my voice, or I use my first the first person, and it makes it stronger, and it's clear that it's my opinion. So maybe your opinion is different, but this is my opinion. When we are doing the edition, we are choosing all the time words, and they're like, with the words you use, you can like create distance, like put yourself away, or you can create closeness with the person you are reading because you are engaging the reader. So there's this one thing I found in Twitter, and I really liked it because it's like three types of writing, that you can be very like very high winded, long-winded, or use a lot of words to say the same thing other people say with one or two words. So I think the good writing has to be like the first example here in the top. Maybe in some cases you can go to the second level. The third level is like an exaggeration. It's not correct, but it's like I'm in a glass tower talking to you guys. So I don't think that works. So let's try to be on the lowest level. So be and talk like we normally talk, not write. We shouldn't write things we wouldn't normally say. So when we choose words, if we find a simpler word, it's better. There's a saying by Mark Twain which says that using a $5 word when a 50-cent word will do is a bad idea. So use your cheapest word you can find. And the other is, if you can say the same thing with less in like uh, in a shorter blog post, if you can reduce and take away things, it's better. So every word should do something. It's like imagine that your article is like a machine or a clock, where where every gear has a purpose. There are no extra things. So that should be also valid for what we're writing. These are a few examples of choosing words. On the left side we have the complex side, and we can replace them with simpler words. And I think in the like 90% of the cases, using the simpler word is better. There are also expressions that tend to be too long or too wordy, and we can like replace them with simple alternatives. This is one example of saying the same thing in less and more like impact has a lot more impact. This is another example. These examples are going to be more and more absurd as as I advance, but it's just to make a point. I like this is because it's really like we are trying to to use a lot of word to like uh, take away our responsibility. We're like talking our talking outside, talking a lot, and it doesn't really. We're not saying a lot. We're just using words to divert the attention. Here are more word expressions. There's some expressions that are like redundant, like very unique. It doesn't make sense because it's unique. Or their personal friends are just friends. There's when you go to into addition, you can start to see these things. That you can change. I'm going to show a few tools to help you later to find these things, but this is like the basic idea. Find things that you can simplify. There are some kinds of words that are used like they're called whistle words. The whistle is this animal that likes to hide, and the problem is that we tend to use them like when we are unsure of what we are saying, and it gives like a false sense of authority. Like it gives more authority to our writing without real. We're quoting like quoting a person that doesn't exist, like some expert. We're talking. We're like adding more weight to our words without saying more things. And these are some examples of they're not wrong, but they're they tend to be weak, because we are like citing things that we are not stating. We are citing. We have been. This happens a lot when, for example, when reading journal. You think you say that experts say things or evidence. So if you have evidence or you have a quote from someone who is an expert, you should use it or link to it at least. But use it like this in the vacuum. It doesn't really. It makes you sound like you are not sure of what you're writing, and it's like it's better to pay attention to that and maybe do not say it. Take it out or try to avoid these types of expressions. There's also another type of wizard words that are hedge words, hedging, and it comes from like when you are like trying to play a game of chance and you kind of you're playing the roulette and you put one chip on one number and one chip in another color, and like you're trying to all cover all your bases. Like, okay, if I'm wrong about this, at least I said uh, at least I have like an excuse. It's like a way of not being concrete about facts. Here are some words that tends to be used as hedging words, and they're not wrong, but when we have them in this writing, we should say, okay, are we sure about the thing we're writing, or if we're not sure, we should first make sure, do more research, and be very like direct. And if you have like a quote, a number, a value, something that's very concrete, you should use that instead of using this kind of vague words that tend to make people do not trust you as a writer. So the other thing that is kind of used sometimes used as whistling, as taking your responsibility of writing something direct, is using the passive word voice. It's longer by definition, uh, can be ambiguous, and it's more difficult to read. It has less life in the sentence. This is one example. The form needs to be processed before the prescription can be dispensed. One way of identifying the passive voice is adding by zombies, into the sentence, and if it makes sense with by zombies, it's a passive voice construction, and it's when you identify this thing, you can like change it and put the people, because the first the first version doesn't have anyone. There's no people in this sentence. We should put people if we can, and this active voice version is clearer because it's clear who is going to do what. So you're putting someone behind the action. Uh, so here's a way of using passive voice to not take responsibility. You know, we can take the person out of the sentence and make it not about someone and about anyone, and we're like, okay, we're not owning up to the mistake. Here mistakes were made. It's better to say who made it. If I made it, let's say I made it, and use the person if you can. There are some cases in which passive voice has some uses and it's useful. Some people will say never use them, but I think there are cases where it works better than the active voice. In the scientific world, it's used a lot and it's part of, it's expected, so there's no problem there. There's another chance of using passive voice is when we don't care about the person who is doing the action. Here, for example, errors were being thrown all across the dashboard. Doesn't care because it's no one, it's the system doing that. So we don't. The important thing is what's happening. The other use is when we want to emphasize the actions, or maybe the subject is obvious. For example, we are talking about vaccines that are being applied. We don't we don't. That's what we want to say. The subject, the actor here is obviously maybe a doctor, a nurse, someone of that kind. So in this case, it's perfectly fine. And the other usage is when we have the actor is evident, because we mentioned it before, so we don't have to repeat it. Other kinds of words we normally have to pay attention are adverbs, which are words that you can put next to a verb or to an adjective, and it like modifies the verb. And there, for example, they always in English end with the same termination, li, and they're easy to use, but they are also easy to abuse because they tend to uh, we tend to grab them and put it next to the verb, to like modify it. And they're easy, but the problem is that if we overuse them, it sounds tiring. This sound is tiring, and it tends to make things longer than needed. So when we have an adverb, we should think if it's doing some work, or if we can take it out. One way is simply taking it out, and if it works, we should do it. It was not doing something, so it was extra. The other option is to replace the whole adverb with a strong verb. For example, we can replace loudly with yelled or roared, which have the loudness built in the verb. There are also words that, for example, he smiled widely is the same thing as to say that he grinned, because grin has the the same idea of smiling widely, and they smile happily. It's in this case, it's obvious that it's happy, so we can take it out. When you have an adverb that's doing something and adding information, you can keep it, but if it's not doing something, you should take it out. The other thing about making things more simpler and shorter is preferring to use positive forms. A negative form is one thing that says what something is not. The positive form is a word or a sentence that says what something is. So, for example, if I'm saying he is not very often on time, I can say the same things with he usually came late. So in the first is we're saying what is not happening. In the positive form, we're saying what is happening. Here's another example. It's not uncommon to find developers that write. We can say the same thing in less words in positive form with a lot of developers write. So it's not. These are things that if we overuse them, they tend to make the text less lively, more long-winded, and harder to parse. The other thing we have, maybe to pay attention, in some cases, doesn't happen too often with English because uh, English does not have what's called grammatical gender, which is that things have gender. You know, in Spanish, I don't know, Italian, French, in Portuguese, when we use say, when things have gender, like a tree is in Spanish is male, in Portuguese is female, and you have to keep that in mind. That doesn't happen in English, so it's simpler, but there's one problem, one case in which we find that we may fall into a trap, which is when we are talking about one person that is not defined. This is the undefined individual. Here's one example. We are talking about the writer. We're not talking about a writer. We're talking about someone, hypothetical writer. And if we use the he like as a general, like in the neutral form of gender, it doesn't work. It's not wrong, but it sounds strange because it's like we're assuming that the writer is a male. So in here, the example that I find is not right is that the writer usually finds that he has to write his sentences. How do we fix it? How do we make it? We don't use he in this case. One option, there are 5 options. One is to simply take it. If we don't, we can maybe simply not say the pronoun. Here's one example. When we take simply we take his from the sentence and it still works. So we don't need to put someone. There was the person. We don't need a person in this sentence. In this example, we can say no one seems to take any pride in work anymore instead of in his work, and it still works. The other option is to replace the he with I, you, or we. In this case, uh, I'm talking in the first person, and when I use that, I don't have to make assumptions about the gender. I say as a writer, I usually find I have to rewrite my sentences, and it still works. I think it's better, and we don't have this problem. The other option is I don't like to use this, but it's an option is to use his or her, his slash her. It tends to make things too long. Um, in some cases may work, but in general, having like he, she is like it sounds bad. You know, there is another option which is using the plural, and we change he for they. And here's the example, the same example with they. The writers usually find that they have to rewrite their sentences, and they is doesn't have any gender, so it works. Maybe the only downside is that having it's harder to picture a group of people than to picture one person. So when we go into the plural, sometimes it tends to lose some bigger the sentence. Maybe that's the only option, the only downside of using the plural. When that happens, we can also use they in the singular form. And this is something that, at least for me, never was. None of my English teachers mentioned that I remember, but they also works in the singular. This is three examples. This is clearly we're thinking about one person, but we are using they, and it still works, and you're going to see it a lot in a lot of places, and it's kind of very normal at this point. So it's a good option, and I tend to use this more often than the other options. Um, a writer must choose their words carefully. A journalist must not reveal their sources. If anyone calls, tell them I can't come to the phone. This works perfectly, and they in singular form. They also tend to work better when we are talking about people without, a binary gender. When you are thinking about non-binary identities, they tends to work better. This one example I took from the American Heritage Dictionary. When you look up day, this example is there, and it's a way of using a gender neutral pronoun in the singular form, and it works in this case. It's the best, I think, option we have. uh, Singular day is not new. It was written in at least uh, uh, like Shakespeare. It was used in his plays, and even that before that. So it's not something that's appeared recently. It has a lot of history. So no one is going to. If someone says you're writing it wrong, you can show them that example. There's also a nice video from Tom Scott on YouTube which talks about gender neutral pronouns, and I recommend it. He explains very, very well how it works. Um, and we are kind of nearing the end of this section. I want to finish that part of the edition with talking about the rhythm. Um, Here's one example I took from there is this one book from which is called 100 ways of writing better, something like that. And basically this teach us or shows us that when we read, we are like speaking to ourselves. We are using like reading with our ears. If we read this aloud, we see that we find that is boring. It's like it tends to lose vitality. Let's read it. It's this sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5 word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. So this is like the first part of the example. The second part is that he changes the length of the sentences, and he puts long and short sentences together. And what happens is it's like becomes alive. It's now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. The writing thing has a pleasant rhythm, a little harmony, and it goes like if you put short sentences and long sentences, you can uh, you can make the paragraph become much more interesting. And that's one way of finding this is reading aloud. We're doing the edition, and we read it aloud, and we hear how it says, how it sounds. If we are with people, we can just mumble, but we need the sound when we are doing this part. So when before you finish the draft, do at least one time this reading aloud and see how it sounds, because when we read, we hear what we read, and people are going to notice that. The other way of like finding it when we are writing it, the paragraph, is to put every sentence in its own like line, and you can visually see if they're all the same length or not. So you can kind of visually see how we are composing a paragraph, and then you put take the white space and put form the paragraph once you are happy with the order. So let's talk a little bit about tools for writing. There are more a lot. I'm going to mention some of them. The first one I like to use is Grammarly. I think maybe everyone knows it at this point, but it does a lot. It has like a premium tier, but the basic tier is very good, and it can show like alternatives, passive voice. It makes suggestions. It finds like punctuation errors, and so I think at some point in the edition you should like use that to do a Grammarly path. There's one tool that works like Grammarly. It has less features, but more languages. It has more languages, not just English. It's called Language Tool. There's also this one. It's a website, and there's also an application to download. It's called Hemingway Editor, and it's different. The approach is to make the text simpler, so it highlights your sentences with colors. Red is very complex, yellow is complex, and you see adverbs and you see passive voice, and it gives you like some grade, and it says, okay, you're using too many adverbs or you need too much passive voice. So it's visually lets you see things you know to simplify. And if you are seeing a lot of red, maybe it's time you have to keep writing and the edition process. We are not finished. And the other one I like to use, the one is when like I'm stuck. Uh, you can write on the left side your paragraph, and it offers suggestions. It's like it rewrites the paragraph using it has like an AI model, and you can like click on the words and see alternatives, and even the basic free tier works very well. And it's good when you have like a sentence that you don't know how to reword. It's not good, but you're kind of stuck, so it gives you ideas. You can take part of these suggestions, so maybe it unlocks some things. So it's a good way of having like more versions. Then we need graphics in our blog post. There are a lot of, this is one site that's Infinite Canvas Tools. It has like tons of uh, drawing applications and websites free to do graphics. I like to use because I got like used to it, to use whimsical.com to do most of my writing, but you can use that one or check from the Infinite Canvas other options to see which there's a ton of them. Also, the Google Docs and the syntax checker it has picked things that no other tool has picked. So it's a good way of like doing an extra proofreading. To If you can go to Google Docs and use that, it's very good. And one thing I like to do is to, when I'm also like near the end, I'm almost done, to print it out in uh, maybe a small letter size, but print it out. And when you change the medium, it like gives you like another fresh eyes. It's like it looks different, and I find it helps me to this is something that I thought it was good and good enough to publish, but I printed out and found things to change. So it's an alternative. Let's mention a few dictionaries. You can pick whatever you like. I like the American Heritage Dictionary because it's like it's free. It has it uses a panel of writers. They make a survey every year, and they send to writers, to professors, researchers, and they give opinions on words. So in some words, you can see how the panel like voted, how many people like this word, how many people didn't like the word. You can see how the word changed, like it wasn't accepted a few years ago and now it is. So you have extra information for some types of words. So we like it because I like the words, learning about the words. And then we need some thesaurus, maybe to refresh grammar. The punctuation, you should like read about punctuation because there are difference between different types of dashes, semicolons, commas, how to use them. So these are good reference materials. Books, there, if you are going to read one, I think you should read Elements of Style because it's a short book with the rules, and it has like 100 years and it's still being re-edited every year. So it's evidently good. The other are more if you are into writing and you want, to dedicate more time. William Cisner is a journalist, and Steven Pinker is a professor. I think he's a linguist, and it goes very, very, very deeply in how the brain works with language. So it's interesting. So if you want to earn money writing, so I'm going to leave the slides. I'm going to share the slides. You can check these links to have places to write. Um, and I think we're nearing the end. If you want to contact me, at any point, I'm on the Slack, on the Semaphore community Slack. my Twitter and my email. My blog is a little bit out of date, but I promise I'm going uh, to work on it soon. Uh, and I want to thank you all for being here with me.